In 1973, when the United States pulled its final helicopters off the roof of a Saigon embassy, Vietnam was left as one of the most poorest countries in the world. But this is the Vietnam of today. It has become a hyper-capitalist dream. It is the manufacturing darling of Apple, Intel, and Samsung, and the single biggest beneficiary of the corporate exodus from China. Yet it is still ruled entirely by an authoritarian communist party. The United States dropped 7.8 million tons of bombs on Vietnam to stop the spread of a communist economic ideology. They failed, but what happened over the next 40 years proves a brutal reality of geopolitics. Winning a war is an event. Running a country is a math equation. This is the story of how the communists won the war, but capitalism won the peace. To understand the sheer scale of Vietnam's modern economic miracle, you have to understand exactly how close this country came to total collapse following the reunification of the country in 1975. The Vietnamese Communist Party did exactly what orthodox Marxist-Leninist doctrine told them to do. They implemented a Soviet-style, centrally planned command economy. In a capitalist system, prices are decided by millions of tiny decentralized interactions between supply and demand. If people want more rice, the price of rice goes up, which incentivizes farmers to grow more rice, which increases supply and brings the price back down. The system self-corrects, but in a centrally planned economy, the state is the sole, unquestioned arbiter of reality. The government banned private enterprise. They outlawed the free market. They controlled the price of every single grain of rice, every piece of fabric, and every bolt of steel. This era is known locally as the Thoi Bao Cap, or the subsidy period, and it was an absolute systemic nightmare. The most critical failure of the system happened in the dirt. To force rapid industrialization and socialist purity, the state implemented forced agricultural collectivization under strict government mandates during the post-1975 collectivization drives. Farmers across the country, including those in the Mekong Delta, historically one of the most fertile, biologically rich rice bowls of Asia, were stripped of their long-term land ownership. You no longer farmed your land. You farmed the state's land within an agricultural cooperative. Under this system, farmers were forced to hand over their entire crop yield to the state after local communist cadres deducted production costs, agricultural taxes, state reserve quotas, and various opaque administrative fees to fund the government apparatus. Farmers were often left with barely 20% of their own harvest. This created a systemic economic flaw, the total destruction of the profit incentive. When working 14 hours yields the exact same state-mandated ration as working 4 hours, the profit incentive is destroyed. With no reason to innovate or maintain equipment, labor productivity collapsed. By 1978, Vietnam saw its annual rice output drop to a historic low of 9.79 million tons. This caused an absurdity. Vietnam was suddenly forced to import nearly 1.6 million tons of milled rice from the Soviet bloc just to prevent mass starvation, and the geopolitical timing couldn't have been worse. In 1978, responding to brutal cross-border massacres, Vietnam invaded Cambodia to overthrow the genocidal Khmer Rouge regime. The Khmer Rouge were closely allied with China. In retaliation for Vietnam's invasion, China launched a military assault across Vietnam's northern border in 1979. Now Vietnam was fighting a two-front war. They were forced to maintain the fourth largest standing army in the world, which was consuming up to 50% of the entire national budget while their domestic economy was in ruins. In response to the Cambodian invasion, the United States and the United Nations slapped Hanoi with trade embargoes. China completely cut them off. Vietnam was entirely isolated from the global capitalist economy. They were completely reliant on the Soviet Union and the Comecon bloc, which pumped in approximately 8.7 billion rubles in economic aid between 1980 and 1985 just to keep the Vietnamese state from flatlining. Domestically, the economy ground to a halt. Citizens were subjected to a soul-crushing system of stamp rationing because money essentially lost its utility. You needed a government-issued stamp to survive. A stamp for 13 kilograms of rice a month. A stamp for a scrap of meat, a stamp for cooking oil, even a stamp to buy a spare tire for your bicycle. Acquiring daily calories became a full-time job. People without elite government status spent entire days standing in lines at state-run stores, hoping the shelves wouldn't be empty by the time they reached the front. Because grain was so scarce, people resorted to eating bobo, a grim mixture of rice heavily diluted with sorghum, cassava, and sweet potatoes. Foods traditionally meant for livestock. With a per capita income estimated at a mere $125 to $200 per year, Vietnam had plummeted to the absolute bottom of the global economic ladder. They ranked among the 20 poorest nations on Earth. Desperate to fix the imbalances in supply and demand, the government did what governments usually do when they run out of money. They made a fatal monetary miscalculation. In late 1985, the government in Hanoi initiated a disastrous currency reform known as the price-wage money adjustment. Their logic was deeply flawed, but simple. There is too much black market money floating around. If we wipe out the cash, we wipe out the black market and stabilize prices. The state announced that the old currency was dead. They replaced the old 10 dong note with a new 1 dong note, but they placed a strict low cap on how much money a single family was allowed to convert. If you had saved up cash over a lifetime, it was instantly vaporized. The government effectively confiscated the wealth of the entire population, and overnight, simultaneously, they severely devalued the currency's foreign exchange rate from 1.2 to 15 dong per US dollar. The goal was to contract the money supply. Instead, it triggered one of the most violent wage price spirals of the 20th century. The central planners forgot about their own factories under the Soviet model. The central bank essentially handed state-owned factories a blank check to pay their workers, regardless of whether they actually produced anything of value. Because the 1985 currency swap wiped out the working capital of the state factories, they couldn't afford their operating expenses. To prevent a collapse of state industry, the central bank simply turned the money printers back on. They flooded the enterprise circuit with billions in new, unbacked currency. This destroyed the purchasing power of the currency. The velocity of money skyrocketed. As soon as workers got paid, they sprinted to the black market to buy hard goods: gold, rice, US dollars. Before the paper money lost its value in 1985, inflation was roughly 144%. By the end of 1986, it peaked at 774.7%. The economy wasn't just failing, it was actively cannibalizing itself. Down at the grassroots level, in the shadows, something fascinating was happening. Human beings are incredibly resilient, and when faced with starvation, political ideology goes out the window. Before the government officially changed its policies, the people did. It was a phenomenon known locally as phá ráo, which translates to fence breaking. History books often suggest that visionary leaders passed laws to save the people. The reality is usually the opposite. The people break the laws until the government is forced to legalize their survival. Take a man named Kim Ngoc back in the late 1960s. He was the Communist Party secretary of Vinh Phu province. He saw firsthand that collective farming was starving his people. So, at immense personal risk, he secretly introduced household contracting. He quietly allowed families to keep and sell whatever surplus crops they grew above the state quota. Vinh Phu's agricultural output immediately exploded. When Hanoi found out, they were furious. They shut it down, severely reprimanded Kim Ngoc, and forced him to write a humiliating self-criticism. He died in 1979, labeled a capitalist sympathizer. By the 1980s, the central government couldn't stop the fence breaking. It was happening everywhere. State-owned factory managers in Ho Chi Minh City, desperate for raw materials that the central plan wasn't delivering, began secretly buying and selling on the black market. Down in Long An province, local officials quietly permitted farmers to sell their surplus grain at market prices. They were breaking the ideological fence. They were engaging in underground capitalism just to survive. And it was working. The areas that broke the rules thrived. The areas that followed the rules starved. By 1986, the existential fear of economic backwardness reached the highest levels of the Politburo. The Central Party knew the fence breaking was happening. They also knew that cracking down on it would cause the entire fragile economy to finally snap. They realized a truth. If the Communist Party wanted to maintain its grip on power, they had to do the unthinkable. They had to look at the capitalist system they had just spent 30 years fighting, and they had to copy it. In July 1986, the hardline, fiercely orthodox General Secretary of the Communist Party, Le Duan, died. His passing created a power vacuum and a more pragmatic, reform-minded faction led by the newly elected Nguyen Van Linh. A man who had observed the successes of fence breaking in the South seized the moment. In December 1986, during the 6th National Party Congress, the Vietnamese government officially looked in the mirror, admitted the economic model was a failure, and initiated a sweeping, historic series of economic reforms. They called it Doi Moi, which translates simply to renovation. The party explicitly did not dismantle their political system. There was no glasnost, and the hammer and sickle stayed. But they took a sledgehammer to their economic model. They officially abandoned central planning and transitioned to what they uniquely branded a socialist-oriented market economy. It is a magnificent geopolitical oxymoron. It basically means we are communists, but we are going to use the ruthless efficiency of free market capitalism to make ourselves rich. The intellectual architects of the reform, like Foreign Minister Nguyen Co Thach, warned the leadership that Vietnam was lagging dangerously behind the global technological revolution. Furthermore, China, having begun its own capitalist market reforms under Deng Xiaoping in 1978, was already beginning to export quantities of cheaper, higher quality goods. Vietnam had to adapt or face economic irrelevance. The most critical battleground for Doi Moi was the dirt itself. On April 5, 1988, the Politburo issued Resolution 10. This was the watershed document. Resolution 10 officially dismantled the collective farming system. The state granted farmers long-term land use rights. They didn't own the land. The state still owned the dirt, but the farmers owned the harvest. Price controls were completely eradicated for the first time in over a decade. A Vietnamese farmer could plant a seed, harvest the crop, and sell it on the open market for a personal profit. When you reintroduce the profit incentive to human beings, the results are explosive. The speed of the turnaround defied belief. In 1986, total rice output hovered around 18 million tons, unable to feed the population. By 1989, just 1 year after Resolution 10 was fully implemented, Vietnam didn't just have enough food to feed itself. It had a surplus. In a single year, Vietnam went from importing food to survive to exporting 1.4 million tons of rice to the world, earning $322 million in highly coveted foreign exchange. This momentum compounded. The government realized that the central highlands of Vietnam had the perfect altitude and climate for growing Robusta coffee. By handing land rights back to farmers and allowing them to keep the profits, Vietnam triggered a coffee boom. In 1990, Vietnam produced almost zero coffee. Today, they are the second largest coffee producer in the world, trailing only Brazil. By introducing sound monetary policies like raising interest rates to positive levels to match inflation, the government crushed the hyperinflation crisis, bringing the rate down from 774% to single digits by 1993. Between 1990 and 2000, Vietnam's GDP grew at an incredible average of 7.6% per year. It is one of the most successful poverty alleviation campaigns in human history. Domestic reform had a ceiling. You can grow all the rice and coffee in the world, but agriculture alone does not build a modern, industrialized superpower. Recognizing that domestic savings were virtually non-existent, hovering at just 9% of GDP in the mid-1980s, the government knew that if they wanted to build highways, tech hubs, and deep water ports, they needed unprecedented inflows of foreign direct investment, FDI. They looked at the explosive export-driven economic miracles happening in Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. They realized that to get rich, they needed to plug themselves into the global supply chain. And to do that, they needed to normalize relations with the architect of global capitalism, the very country that had tried to bomb them into the Stone Age. This pivot triggered the ultimate strategic paradox of the 20th century. The very same country that had dropped those 7.8 million tons of bombs and sacrificed 58,000 American lives in a proxy war designed specifically to prevent the spread of communism into South Vietnam was now preparing to become their biggest capitalist partner. The US had lost the military war. The dreaded domino had fallen. For 2 decades following the fall of Saigon, Washington treated Vietnam as a bitter, hostile enemy. The US maintained a strict, punishing trade embargo that froze all economic and diplomatic ties. Vietnam was completely locked out of the US-dominated global financial system. By the early 1990s, the tectonic plates of the world had fundamentally shifted. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed into a dozen fractured states. Simultaneously, American multinational corporations were entering the era of hyperglobalization. Companies like Nike, Coca-Cola, and Ford were hunting the globe for cheap, skilled labor. They looked at Vietnam's population, over 70 million people, mostly young, highly literate, and hungry for work. And American CEOs began heavily lobbying Washington to open the doors. Despite the unresolved trauma of the war, the lobbying power of American corporate titans was undeniable. By 1994, President Bill Clinton broke the political stalemate and officially lifted the 30-year trade embargo. The following year, diplomatic relations were normalized. The floodgates didn't just open. They shattered. Almost immediately, American corporate titans arrived. The United States, the country that had leveled Vietnamese cities to prevent a communist economic takeover, was invited in by the Communist Party to build mega-factories. In 2000, the two former enemies signed the U.S.-Vietnam Bilateral Trade Agreement, BTA. It was a landmark, game-changing deal that dropped average U.S. tariffs on Vietnamese imports from a crippling 40% down to a mere 4%. The growth of this relationship is practically unparalleled in modern history. In 1995, bilateral trade was a rounding error, barely $450 million. Today, trade between the US and Vietnam sits at roughly $150 billion a year. The United States is now Vietnam's largest export market. Take a single American company, Nike. Nike doesn't actually make shoes. They design and market them while outsourcing the physical manufacturing. Today, roughly 50% of all Nike footwear in the entire world is manufactured by Vietnamese workers. Washington realized the truth about modern empire building. You don't need to defeat a country militarily to bring them into your sphere of influence. You simply integrate them into the capitalist machine. Vietnam gained the foreign currency and the technological transfer they desperately needed to industrialize. The United States gained access to an incredibly competitive labor pool. Today, the US runs a $123.5 billion trade deficit with the communist nation. But as the 21st century progressed, Vietnam's role fundamentally shifted. Making sneakers and sweatshirts is how a developing economy gets off the ground. But Vietnam wanted to fly. And to do that, they were going to exploit the biggest geopolitical rivalry of the modern era. They were going to drain the supply chains directly out of China. Fast forward to the 2020s. Vietnam's capitalist experiment has evolved into a strategic geopolitical weapon. For 4 decades, China was the undisputed factory of the world. If you wanted to build an electronic device, you built it in Shenzhen. No other country possessed the infrastructure, the scale, or the supply chain density of the Chinese coast. But that era of unchallenged Chinese dominance is actively fracturing. Starting in 2018 with the US-China trade war, aggressive tariffs were slapped on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese exports almost overnight. Doing business in China became a financial liability. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic, where China's draconian zero-COVID lockdowns froze global supply chains overnight. Simultaneously, as China became wealthier, its domestic labor costs surged. Western and South Korean tech giants panicked. They realized that having 90% of their manufacturing locked inside a single country, a country increasingly at odds with the US government, was a massive existential risk. This birthed the most important corporate mandate of the 21st century, the China Plus One strategy. The strategy is simple. Keep your primary operations in China to serve the domestic Chinese market. But shift your core export production capacity to a backup nation. Companies scoured the globe for that plus one. India had the population but terrible infrastructure and bureaucratic red tape. Mexico was close to the US but lacked the deep electronics ecosystem. Vietnam was geographically and politically perfect, ideal for supply chain diversification. First, there is the sheer geographic arbitrage. Vietnam shares a highly integrated 800-mile land border directly with China's southern manufacturing hubs. This geographic proximity is critical because a smartphone requires thousands of tiny components: screws, microchips, glass screens, battery cells. China still produces the vast majority of these raw subcomponents. If an Apple supplier moves final assembly to India or Mexico, they have to put all those Chinese components on a cargo ship, wait 3 weeks for it to cross an ocean, and pray the supply chain doesn't break. If they move to Vietnam, they just put the components on a truck. You can load a semi-truck with components in Shenzhen at 8 p.m., drive it down the highway one day, and have it arrive at an assembly plant in northern Vietnam by 8 a.m. the next morning. No complex ocean freight required. Border crossings like the Friendship Pass at Yu Guan Port have been heavily upgraded into smart border gates. They utilize 5G-enabled license plate recognition and automated vertical container handling systems to clear up to 2,500 cargo trucks a day in as little as 20 minutes per vehicle. The cargo hardly stops moving. Northern Vietnam operates as a seamless, frictionless extension of the Chinese supply chain, but it sits safely on the other side of a political border, immune to US anti-China tariffs. Second, the labor arbitrage is undeniable. Despite China's immense scale, its rising standard of living has heavily eroded its low-cost advantage. By 2025, minimum wages in major Chinese tech hubs are approaching $400 a month. Just across the border in Hanoi, it's under $200, with labor costs offering roughly a 50% discount compared to Chinese benchmarks. The exodus of multinational tech giants into Vietnam was a mathematical certainty. The South Korean conglomerate Samsung essentially bet its entire hardware future on Vietnam. They have poured an accumulated $23.2 billion into the country. Today, Samsung's Thai Nguyen facility is the largest mobile phone factory on the planet. Over 50% of all Samsung smartphones sold globally are manufactured by Vietnamese workers. Samsung's operations are so vast that their 2024 revenue in Vietnam accounted for approximately 13% of the country's entire GDP. Let that sink in. One foreign capitalist company produces 13% of a communist nation's economic output. And then there's Apple. In 2016, Apple had only 18 supplier facilities in Vietnam. By 2024, that number nearly doubled to 35, making Vietnam Apple's largest production hub in Southeast Asia. Apple directed its contract manufacturers, companies like Foxconn, Luxshare, and Gore-Tex, to spend billions establishing sprawling assembly complexes in northern provinces like Bac Ninh and Bac Giang. Apple has aggressively pivoted, with analysts projecting that by 2025, Vietnam will manufacture 20% of all iPads and 65% of all AirPods globally. Vietnam had officially stolen the crown jewels of consumer electronics assembly. Assembling earbuds is basically low-margin labor. It's the sweatshop of the tech industry. Vietnam doesn't want to stop there. They want to control the brain of the 21st century. As the United States and China enter a new Cold War over advanced technology, the most critical resource on Earth is no longer oil. It is semiconductors. Advanced microchips power everything from your iPhone to artificial intelligence to F-35 fighter jets. Washington has actively blocked China from acquiring advanced chips, and the US government is aggressively pushing a policy called friendshoring, moving critical supply chains out of hostile territory and into the borders of friendly, stable nations. Vietnam has raised its hand to become the ultimate silicon firewall. In late 2024, the Vietnamese Prime Minister formally approved the National Semiconductor Strategy 2024 to 2030. Vietnam isn't trying to build fabs, the multi-billion-dollar foundries that physically print the chips onto silicon. Those require $20 billion investments, massive amounts of ultra-pure water, and extreme power grids, which are currently dominated by Taiwan's TSMC. Instead, Vietnam is capturing the critical back end of the industry. It's called OSAT, Outsourced Semiconductor Assembly and Test. Once a silicon wafer is printed in Taiwan, it is highly fragile and useless on its own. It has to be cut into individual chips, wired to microscopic connection pads, encased in protective plastic or ceramic, and rigorously tested for thermal failures. That is OSAT. It is labor-intensive, requires thousands of highly skilled engineers, and it is the exact choke point of the global supply chain. Foreign direct investment is validating Vietnam's strategy in real time. Intel already operates its largest global back-end factory right in Ho Chi Minh City. This single facility processes roughly 50% of Intel's entire global packaging and testing volume. Half of the chips powering the world's PCs pass through a communist country. Following suit, the American semiconductor giant Amkor Technology recently invested $1.6 billion to open an advanced packaging megaplant in Bac Ninh province. South Korea's Hana Micron has committed $930 million to expand its own chip packaging capacity. Currently, Vietnam controls roughly 1% of global semiconductor packaging. By 2030, that figure is projected to skyrocket to 9%. But this incredible growth hasn't come without severe growing pains. You can't run a 21st century microchip facility on a 20th century power grid. In the scorching summer of 2023, extreme heat waves and droughts crippled Vietnam's hydropower dams, particularly the Son La Dam in the north. Water levels dropped to historic 13-year lows. The result was a power crisis. Massive, unannounced rolling blackouts swept across the north and manufacturing hubs, sometimes lasting up to 26 hours. The government literally had to ask Foxconn and Samsung to voluntarily reduce their power usage by 30% just to keep the grid from completely collapsing. The blackouts cost the manufacturing sector an estimated $1.4 billion in lost output. Multinational corporations explicitly warned Hanoi that if they couldn't guarantee uninterrupted electricity, the billions in FDI would stop flowing. The government reacted with authoritarian speed, rapidly constructing a 500 kilovolt transmission line from the central provinces to the industrial north in just 6 months. A project that would typically take years in a Western democracy, and heavily pivoted toward liquefied natural gas imports to stabilize the grid. Vietnam's ability to survive these bottlenecks and attract this capital relies entirely on how they play the geopolitical game, because they aren't just allying with the United States. They are playing everyone. This is what Hanoi officially calls bamboo diplomacy. Think about a bamboo tree. It has solid, unshakable roots representing Vietnam's fierce independence and its strict four-nose defense policy. No military alliances, no affiliating with one country to counteract another, no foreign military bases on Vietnamese soil, and no using force in international relations. But its branches are flexible, bending whichever way the wind is blowing. Vietnam is a masterclass in geopolitical hedging. They refuse to pick a side in the new Cold War. In 2023, they upgraded the United States to a comprehensive strategic partnership, the highest diplomatic tier they offer to secure American tech investments. But just 3 months later, they rolled out the red carpet for China's Xi Jinping, signing dozens of agreements to integrate Chinese rail and supply chains into Vietnam. A few months after that, they hosted Russia's Vladimir Putin to maintain their historical military supply lines. Vietnam leverages the anxiety of superpowers to extract maximum economic benefit for itself. They know that both Washington and Beijing need Vietnam more than Vietnam needs them. So they smile at Washington, they smile at Beijing, and they quietly build more factories. The United States spent a decade, billions of dollars, and tens of thousands of lives trying to bomb a capitalist ideology into Vietnam. It failed. But the central planners in Hanoi couldn't defeat the math of their own economy. A farmer will only work the dirt if he keeps the harvest. Today, the hammer and sickle still fly over Hanoi. There is no political opposition. But economically, the Communist Party survived by embracing the very system they fought to destroy. They learned the ultimate rule of 21st century survival. You don't protect your borders with an ideology, you protect them by making sure the rest of the world cannot afford to let your factories stop. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for our next interesting video coming soon. This is Kyle, and you are watching Beyond Economy.